All right, let's get started. What's going on, everyone? Hope everyone had a spectacular holiday season and welcome to our first KeyShot 9 webinar of the new year. My name is Kareem Merchant and I'm one of the new creative specialists here at Luxion based out of our Orange County, California headquarters. I hope everyone joining us today has had the chance to explore all the new and exciting features we've introduced in KeyShot 9. And for those who have not, you can download a free trial copy of KeyShot at keyshot.com/try. In this webinar, we'll be taking a deep dive into the new KeyShot 9 Fuzz Shader and learning how adding fuzz to your KeyShot projects can greatly elevate your material renderings. As always, a recording of this webinar will be available at youtube.com/keyshot3d, where we'll also post a download link to this presentation. The comments section on YouTube is a great place to engage in the KeyShot 9 conversation, and it's also a great place to let us know your thoughts on new features, as well as post comments and suggestions relating to future learning content. All right, let's talk a little bit about the rig I'm currently using for this webinar. I'm presenting from an HP Z8 with dual Intel Xeon Gold 6154 processors at 3 GHz with 96 gigs of RAM, running Windows 10 Pro and powered by a Quadro RTX 4000 GPU. I'd also like to mention that a few of our Luxion team members are standing by to answer any questions you may have regarding the new Fuzz Shader, so please don't hesitate. Feel free to ask away. All right, to give a little overview of what we'll be covering today, we'll continue the webinar with a tech overview by one of our software engineers in a moment, and then look at how the Fuzz feature can play a role in bolstering your soft goods project workflows, as well as some best practices and tips and tricks that should help make your Fuzz applications hassle-free and highly effective. I'll present a demo running through some of the Fuzz node functions and settings, and we'll finish with some Q&A with the Luxion team and myself. This is going to be a feature-focused webinar, so we should cover a fair amount of ground over the course of this presentation. With that said, let's jump into our Tech Talk segment with lead developer Soren Gommelmark. Unfortunately, he can't be here in person today, so he's taken the time to record an incredibly informative segment introducing us to the science behind Fuzz and how its creation relates to RealCloth. Give me 1 second here while I cue that up for you guys.
Hi, my name is Soren Gommelmark. I'm one of the developers who worked on RealCloth and Fuzz in KeyShot 9. I'm going to give you a bit of a presentation in some of the technical details of Fuzz, how it's related to RealCloth and how it's not related to RealCloth. So let's first have a little bit of a look at that. Both Flyaways on RealCloth and the Fuzz is very similar in many ways. They use some of the same code, some of the same ideas, and are very similar in nature. In particular, if you look at the shading, it will be very similar, but there are some key differences. For example, if you do Flyaways on RealCloth, you will see that they tend to align with the flow of the yarn directions on the underlying weave pattern. It also takes the color, or each individual fiber takes the color for the underlying yarn they arise from. And you can see this on this very extreme example I took on the left, where you see the fibers sticking out of the red parts are red and the fibers sticking out of the blue part are blue. And they also tend to be oriented differently depending on whether or not it's the blue or the red it arises from. In contrast, Fuzz is not tied to the underlying cloth shading, as you can see on the right. And you have greater control over Fuzz. It's more controllable in a sense, but that can also sometimes be a disadvantage if you really want the realistic appearance that you can get with RealCloth. But let's get back to how the RealCloth Flyaways respond to light. And this is also the default shading that you will see on Fuzz fibers. So if you have a single piece of fiber, like in this case indicated by the red cylinder, and it is hit by light, indicated by the yellow arrow pointing towards the incident light, then this light is going to be reflected off the surface of the fiber, and this is actually going to result in a specular reflection in a cone around the axis of the fiber. And I've shown this with green. And the cone even extends fairly much towards the back, or at least towards the grazing edge of the incident light towards the fiber. And another component of the light scattering off this fiber is the red one I've shown, which is also conical in shape, but is the result of two refractions into the plastic fiber I've shown. So I've created a small scene where I set the transmitted light as red and the specular reflected light as green. As you can see, the material properties and the arrow is pointing to the component of the light. This means that if I put a light source behind the material ball as shown on the right, you can see that since the light source is behind, I should primarily see the transmitted light, which in this case is the red light. So that's why you see this red rim light caused by the light from behind hitting the fibers on the edge of the surface and being transmitted towards the camera direction. And this allows you, because the fibers are sticking out of the surface, this really allows you to send light around edges or corners of a surface, giving you this rim light effect. If I, on the other hand, put the light source in front of the material ball, you can see I primarily see the green color, which is the light that's specularly reflected towards the direction of the incident light. This is very similar to some of the other materials we have in KeyShot, where you can set a specular reflection or you can set a specular transmission color. In this case, however, the resulting appearance is quite different because the reflected and transmitted colors are in a cone around the axis of the fibers, and because the fibers are sticking out of the surface, it gives quite a different effect on the appearance. Another aspect of the fuzz is how do you choose the lengths of each individual fiber. And this is not such an easy question to answer as you might think, because you can do this in many ways. You can, for example, choose a uniform distribution where all the lengths that the user chose is roughly the same or is exactly the same. You can choose a normal distribution, which is the green curve here. It's a bell curve where the lengths tend to cluster. You can choose a different distribution that I'm going to show you in a moment. If you choose the uniform distribution where all the different lengths that you can get are uniformly likely or equally likely, then you get something shown in this image. And you'll notice that there's too many small fibers and you cannot really get a handle on what is the mean value, what is the average length that I kind of perceive them as being. There's no clear indicator of this. So this is not a good way of doing it. If we choose a normal distribution, which is also known as the bell curve, if any of you have heard this, very common in nature, you see that the effect is much better. You have a much clearer sense of where the mean value is. But on the other hand, if you take a close look at, for example, the small flyaway fibers on any clothes you may have nearby, or if you look at a field of grass, you will notice that there is actually often quite a significant amount of outliers, in the sense that there are a significant amount of flyaways that stick further out from the main body of the fibers. And this is not really captured by the normal distribution. We can use different distribution that actually fits very well with measurements of, for example, the distribution of stone sizes or distribution of measured hair lengths or something like that. And it's a more balanced distribution, and you can also see you get more of these long outlier effects that gives it a very natural look compared to the other ones, the other distributions. Another thing that's easy to overlook that you can do with fuzz is you can control the direction. This is implicitly included in the RealCloth Flyaways, but for the fuzz, you can use a normal map to control the direction of each individual fiber sticking out of the surface. You may wonder, why do I need a normal map for that? Because normally I would use a normal map for scratches or something like that. But remember that a normal on a surface is actually just a vector pointing away from the surface, saying what is the tangent plane of the surface, or on which side is the surface pointing. So it's basically a direction attached to the surface pointing in some direction that we can use to control the shading of the surface. And this is why we use normal maps, because we can kind of use that to capture small variation in surface height using a different direction of the tangent plane of the surface. But it is just a direction on the surface, so we can just as well use this normal map to control the direction that the fibers grow out of. Here I made an image to the right, and you can see the normal map in the insert at the center. And I took some inspiration from my background in physics, where this is actually a dipolar field, which is also what you see in rod magnets. So if you take a rod magnet and put a piece of glass on top and you drop a lot of small pieces of metal onto it, you will see exactly this pattern where the small metal rods will align like this. This is because this is actually the shape of the magnetic field of a rod magnet. And I just basically input that vector field as a normal map and loaded it into KeyShot and used it as a direction texture, as you can see in the material graph on the left. So please try and play with this. You can do some very interesting things with this. Finally, to summarize, Fuzz is very much like the RealCloth Flyaways. You have greater flexibility, but with that flexibility comes the cost that it's not so well tied to the underlying weave pattern and the shading of the RealCloth. But you can use it for many different things. And remember to have a look in nature at how does the grass look and how does all sorts of things with things sticking out of it look, and look at the distribution of lengths to see if you can spot this effect that I was talking about. And remember to try to play with the direction texture, because it can create some very interesting effects. Finally, thank you for listening to this Tech Talk segment. I hope it gave you a bit of an inspiration for what to tweak and how to play with it, and a greater understanding of why things are created the way they are. Thank you.
Awesome. A big thanks to Soren for recording that for us. Hopefully that's given all of you a better understanding of the technical aspects of Fuzz and where its code and ideas originated from. On that note, let's jump right into this incredible new KeyShot feature and start exploring some of the ways that Fuzz can enhance your workflow, as well as a few best practices that should help you create a myriad of application-specific effects. To begin with, I'd like to discuss some examples of how varied Fuzz applications can be, hopefully illustrating the incredible amount of flexibility that can be achieved while using the new Fuzz feature. As Soren brought up a moment ago, unlike RealCloth Flyaways, Fuzz is not tied to the underlying weave patterns. This makes customizing Fuzz to your needs much more flexible. On this slide, you can see a series of examples using Fuzz to create some incredibly unique strand-like effects on different types of material surfaces. Here you can see effects from wool-like surfaces in the top left to plasma-like strands, which you can see in the bottom right. Unlike Flyaways, which require accurately mapped UVs to achieve the best results, Fuzz applies to any material and is able by default to map in a perpendicular manner over surface curvatures. For applications that require strands to protrude in specific directions or in specific patterns, control over these elements can be achieved through the material graph, which we'll cover a little later in this webinar. The examples on this page, you can see in the bottom left a speaker that was not UV unwrapped and RealCloth was applied. As you can see over the surface curvature, there's a discrepancy that's occurring. And right here, you can see one with the Fuzz feature, still not UV unwrapped, and you notice that there is no discrepancy around that curvature. The image on the right is illustrating how the Fuzz is affected through that curvature without the unwrapping. At this point, there's a couple things I'd like to bring up in order to make your Fuzz Shader experience a little smoother and more efficient. To begin with, let's talk about updating geometry. You're most likely going to be updating geometry very often in order to accurately create the surface effects that you're after. It's important that you update your geometry nodes after any adjustment in order to visibly see how your settings are progressively altering your surface geometry. There are 3 ways you can go about doing this. The first way is to update by using the geometry execution button that appears in the top right of your real-time view after you've made a geometry adjustment. You can see this highlighted in the top right image of this slide right here, just to the left of the project panel. The second is to locate the execute geometry node button located within the property subtab in the material graph. This is also illustrated on this slide in the bottom right image. You can see that here just underneath the appearance accordion. And the final and fastest way to execute geometry is to simply use the Alt-G command. This instantly triggers the execute geometry update, whether you're in the material graph or in the real-time view. Another important factor to consider is how your normals are oriented. In order to have success when mapping your Fuzz effects, you need to ensure your normals are oriented in the appropriate direction so that Fuzz growth is visible on your object surface. If your normals are incorrectly mapped to the direction you'd like the strands to extrude, then you may experience your geometry updates to failing to produce visible results. Typically, this is not an issue. However, it is something that I've come across before, and it's definitely worth being aware of. Previously, adjustments of normals needed to be made within your modeling software of choice. However, in 9.1, normals can be flipped in program. Here you can see an example of a model that has normals mapped incorrectly, which is causing the fuzz application to be inverted on the body to the right. If this was an enclosed object, you would not be able to see the fuzz and may assume that your fuzz application did not work. Lastly, I'd like to bring attention to something I've experienced while working with fuzz. In some instances, adjusting the density slider has not yielded my desired density. You may have experienced this as well, depending on the scale or type of fuzz application you're working with. Through some experimentation, I've noticed that both the randomness and segment sliders may inadvertently affect the overall perception of surface fuzz density on a given material. When randomness is higher, it causes some fibers to shift direction in a manner that reverses their direction and causes them to not be visible from the front of the material. This may cause fuzz to look less dense overall. If you look at the images on this page, you'll notice two examples. They both share the same settings other than randomness. On the first image, the top image, randomness is set to 0.2, while the second is set to 2. You can clearly see that the low randomness setting, no fibers are visible from the back, while the higher number generates a large amount of visible subsurface fibers. Hopefully that bit of information will help you combat density discrepancies you may experience with your future projects. Now that we've covered some best practices and tips, let's take a look at some of the settings controls that exist under the Fuzz Shader. If you look at the image to the right of the screen, you'll see a screenshot of the Fuzz Properties subtab within the material graph. Notice that there are quite a few different settings from length to maximum curves. Length, length variation, randomness, and segments are going to be your preliminary controls for creating realistic and varied fibers. Naturally, surface fibers tend to be random in direction and length, so adjusting these to mimic real-world geometry is the fastest and the most effective way of adding a higher level of realism to your fuzz applications. Depending on what you're after, this might take a little tweaking here and there, but once you're dialed in, the end results are pretty incredible. You can also control settings such as density and radius, which will help you better match real-world geometry. Adjusting radius and density can make the difference between creating a material that looks heavy and absorbent, such as towel fibers, or light and delicate, such as fuzz found on fruits or insects. The right side of the material graph is also where you'll find your appearance controls when the fuzz geometry node is selected. Here you'll be able to control color, roughness, transmission effects, and refractivity of your fuzz fibers. Take into account that if your base material or any other chosen material is plugged into your surface input on your fuzz geometry node, then your appearance options will appear grayed out and you will not be able to adjust the parameters under the appearance accordion. You can see that here, the input is selected, it's grayed out, you can't control anything there. All right, now that we've looked at using the basic fuzz node parameters to customize your fuzz applications, let's talk about controlling fibers using the texture inputs. If you look at the fuzz geometry node in the material graph, you'll notice that you have 3 texture controls relating to your fuzz application. The first of the 3 is density texture. The density texture allows you to add variation to the density of the fuzz fibers in your application by applying a texture map. When using a black and white texture map, in white areas, the density will match the value you entered in the density parameter, while darker areas will be more sparsely populated with fuzz fibers. In the example on this slide, the bottom plane shows the texture used to manipulate the fuzz density in the top plane. Notice that the highest density area is the area that is 100% white, with the texture losing density as it gradates into pure black. The second node is length textures, where length variation parameter adds a randomness to the length of the fuzz fibers. The length texture enables you to manipulate the length based on a texture map. This will act as a mask to the length while still taking into account your length variation settings. 100% white will result in the length defined under your parameter settings, while darker colors will produce progressively shorter fibers. In this slide's example, you can see a black and white texture map below, which is affecting the overall distribution and patterning of the fuzz effect on the plane above. Take note that the length texture reacts similarly to the density texture example. Areas that are pure white are unaffected, while darker areas exhibit a reduction in fuzz length. Lastly, under the texture controls, we have the direction texture. By default, the fuzz fibers will follow the geometry's normals. Adding a direction texture will enable you to manipulate the direction at which fuzz fibers protrude from the surface. You can use either a normal map or a procedural texture to do this. The bump height of the direction texture controls how much the direction is altered. At a bump height of 0, fibers will follow the normals. Increasing the value will increase the angle at which fibers protrude, while negative values will angle the fibers in the opposite direction. In this example, a normal map is used to manipulate the direction. The bottom plane shows the texture used to manipulate the fuzz direction in the top plane. The first image example, the bump height on that texture map is 1, while it is -1 in the second image. All right, at this point, I'd like to go ahead and jump into our demo and do some real-time exploration of some of the information I've covered so far. So let's go ahead and open up KeyShot. So you can see here, I have a plane that I've dropped in with a geometry, and I'm going to go ahead and open up the material graph so you can see what's going on here. I've applied a texture from the materials panel. I've applied a material. It's just a basic drag and drop material. And I've also selected 3 texture maps that I'm going to be using. You can see those right here. Horizontal tubes, the normal at the bottom here, can be found in the bump maps subtab in the library panel. The texture map linear gradient can be found in your opacity maps at the top, and the KeyShot icon bump can be found in the labels. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start playing with this so you guys can see how our fuzz feature affects our surface. So this is a preset fuzz node that I've already taken the time to adjust so that we'll get a kind of a brush-like effect on the surface. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a new one by going to the right-clicking, choosing geometry, and selecting fuzz. So you can see what the default parameters are going to cause our surface to look like. I'm going to go ahead and use Alt-G to update my geometry, and you can see that we have black fibers that are now on the surface. If we look closely, you can see that these fibers are pretty uniformed, somewhat thick, not exactly what I was going for a brush-like material. You can adjust these simply by going in and clicking on your actual fuzz node. On the right side in the property subtab, you'll have all your different adjustment settings. You can go ahead and adjust those to whatever end product you're looking for. Length variation will make it look a little bit more random. I can go ahead and update that for you, and you can see here fiber length has changed, so there's some flyaways coming up at the top. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this and plug in my existing settings so you can see how I've set it up. I've gone ahead and changed the color as well to match the surface a little bit better. You notice here it looks a little bit more brush-like. I also want to bring attention to the caps on these fibers. If you notice they're rounded, there's a radius across the top of it. That's because I'm using the ribbon option underneath the shape. If I choose cylinder and I update my geometry, you'll notice that they're capped off. Oh, doesn't seem to want to be doing that. But yeah, the cylinder option, if you choose the cylinder, let's plug the other one back in so I can show you. The image will show a capped off tip rather than a rounded tip. You see that right there? So that's the big difference between ribbon and cylinder. You'll notice that difference. So I'm going to go ahead and plug the other one back in, and we'll go ahead and start playing with our texture inputs. Alt-G to update again. And let's start with our bump icon, our KeyShot bump icon. So basically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to plug that into our density texture. I'm going to go ahead and update that. I'm using a white icon bump, which in this case, as I said before, white will show you the settings you've put into your parameters. So you'll notice here that the KeyShot logo is embossed. The fuzz is actually coming out of the white space, and it's assuming that the surrounding area is black, so there's no fuzz in that area. There's an absence of that effect. If you'd like to reverse it and make it seem like it's debossed, you can go ahead and use a black icon. But if you're working with a white one, a really easy way to do this is to just choose the line that's connecting the output to the input, right-click that, go to Utilities, and choose Color Invert. Now, when I update this, I'm going to get a debossed effect with the surrounding area being fuzzy and the actual logo itself having an absence of that effect. If you've looked at our website, a great little animation that has been made for us, this is how you would accomplish that same thing. Same with the Render Weekly. Their Render Weekly logo is accomplished using a similar situation. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete that. I'm going to update my geometry so we're back to square one here. And I'm going to go ahead and move to the length texture. I'm going to plug in the linear gradient for that. I'm going to update my geometry by using Alt-G again, and you'll notice that there's a gradient to my fuzz effect. And I'm going to actually isolate by hitting C on the texture map, so you can see the actual texture map underneath the plane. And you'll notice that 100% white is showing 100% of that effect, while the darkest area is showing an absence of that effect. So you can make some very interesting length textures and length alterations using that effect as well. So I'm going to go ahead and unplug that, and then we'll start playing with the normal. Let's update geometry. I'll just click that this time. So if I plug in my texture map using the horizontal tubes normal into the direction texture, what's going to happen is the colors are going to affect the normals of the plane surface. So we're going to have the normals match the color parameters of the normal map. I'm going to update that. And you can see here, let me isolate it actually, so you can see the colors underneath it. So you can see here how the colors are actually affecting the surface and the fuzz above that. I'll put that up there. If I go into my bump settings, it's at -1 currently. So if I go ahead and I switch it to +1 and I update, you'll notice that they shift directions. And I can further adjust the in-between. If I go 0.5, we'll have the same direction, but a little bit less of a shift. It's less drastic, less noticeable. So you can really control how your actual effects are going to look by adjusting the bump settings within your texture map. And that's that. So, all right, our global training and creative specialist, Ryan Levy, has a quick little tip on animating your fuzz effects. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it on over to him. Ryan, why don't you jump on in here?
Cool. Hi, everyone. This is Ryan. I'd like to thank Kareem and Soren for an excellent presentation on fuzz and its functionality. I wanted to step in for a moment to also briefly mention the animation function in fuzz. This is a really exciting function for me. So what we've done, I've actually rendered out a sample video here just to showcase this. So I'll play this for you. As you can see, it's starting from 0 growth to 100% growth. I actually want to go ahead and walk through this process with you. So let's show these again. So what we're going to do here, I'm just going to, let's execute this geometry node. Let's get this back to 0 here. So what I want to do is actually go into my fuzz parameters here and change this a little bit. I'm going to go to like a 0.06, update that geometry just to show you a little bit more of the effect here. So in order to animate this fuzz, what you want to do is just right click in the material graph, go to the animation drop down here, and in the submenu click curve fade. So what this does when you hit curve fade, it'll be represented in your animation timeline automatically. So if I were to connect this into length texture, you won't really see anything happen right away, even if you scrub through the timeline, because it's really basically the same idea of just using a preset length. So what you're going to have to do is just really scrub through to kind of get an idea of the effect and how it's working. So that's really what I wanted to show you, just a quick tip on that. One other thing to keep in mind, to get a quick preview of this, a good way to do that is to use your preview, render preview here. So that's a really fast way to see what the effect is doing. So that's it. I just, thanks for letting me share that quick tip, and I'll kick it back over to Kareem to wrap us up.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. That was very helpful. Thanks everyone for tuning into this month's KeyShot webinar. I hope we've managed to provide everyone with some useful fuzz related tips and tricks, as well as help you become more confident while applying and controlling your fuzz effects in your KeyShot projects. At this point, let's go ahead and open it up for Q&A.
All right, thanks Kareem. That was excellent. Right. Does fuzz take on the color of the diffuse map?
It does not unless you plug it in specifically. So it won't automatically do that. Let me open this up right here. If you want to have your paint or your color match, you just pull your output from that over to your surface, but you'll notice that your appearance accordion is completely grayed out, so you will not have control over any of these settings if you do that. But yes, it is possible, but not automatically.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
And on animation, a couple asking about, is it possible to do animations, making it wave or blowing in the wind or bending the fibers?
I can answer that. This is Ryan. So at the moment, no. You can use direction textures to have, along with a growing effect on the curve node. But at this time, there's no real physics to moving fuzz at this time.
All right. Mark is asking, are there fuzz presets?
Currently, there are no fuzz presets. Let me jump back real quick to that one. If you actually do look in the materials tab, you can choose fuzz. Let me find it over here. Here you go. Choose fuzz. There are some preset options, not within the material graph, but you can drag and drop these as materials onto it.
All right. There's a couple questions on controlling the color of the fibers, specifically when trying to achieve very light or white fibers.
Yeah, a lot of that's going to come down to not just your color and your specular. It's going to come down to the size. But I can go ahead and I'll jump over here to the appearance accordion, and I can change the color. I'll change it to a white, and you can see that it's starting to, it's not a pure white, but you can affect the fuzz a little bit and make it look whatever color you'd like. So there is some control over that. I saw that Mark was asking about curl, kink, and twist of the actual fibers. You can't really control that so much, but you do have the ability to create some curling and twisting effects. If you increase your randomness, I'm going to kind of over exaggerate this. Let's do 2, and I'll make the variation 1 and Alt G. You can see that this is like a significantly more varied fiber surface. And then the segments, depending on how many segments you have, you can increase those segments. That'll increase how many kinks exist within your fibers. So you can see that there.
I see a question from Nick about color variation, dark and gray hair. So a good way to do that is to use a gradient texture. In the material graph, you can adjust color fades and apply different color parameters to your fuzz, such as one of the fuzz presets is grass. So you'll see that there's a lot of the early growth of that grass is more of a brown texture, and the higher grass is more green. So that's a great way to achieve more realism in your fuzz, is to use color variations. I see another question from Julian. If you imported an animation file with its own physics, like an Alembic cache, would you be able to apply fuzz to it? Yes. I actually import a lot of ABC files into KeyShot. It's one of my favorite things to do. And I do apply fuzz to a few of those files. For instance, simulation of cloth blowing in the wind. You can apply that fuzz to that as well. So yeah, really good question.
I noticed a question from Debbie here too. If you'd like to apply fuzz to just one surface of, let's say, a cube, you could go ahead and split that surface off so that when you apply it, it's isolated. And you can do that by right-clicking on that surface and hitting split objects.
I see another question from Josiah. I see that you said, can you make the fuzz curve around another object in the rendering? Like if there was a ball on a plane you were working with. If I understand that correctly, yes, you can use the curve fade animation node with other objects in your scene. It doesn't have to be just with fuzz. Hey, Eric Rosner, you said, where would you import a limbic into the node? Good question. You would import the limbic like any other piece of geometry into your scene. And once that's imported, you'll see that represented in your animation timeline as well. And then I don't know if you've done that already, but I think it shows up as an orange color. So what you would do is just double click on that geometry and go into the geometry view, material graph, sorry, and add fuzz there.
So I don't have a toothbrush open right now, but I can show you how to use this mesh circular pattern. And we can use that in the density or the length. And we'll get an effect that looks kind of like bristles. Oh, excuse me. So this is the reverse. If I go ahead and I right click and I invert color on that, Alt G. So this would be similar to how you would create each individual bristle on a toothbrush. You just have these much denser, closer together, and longer.
I see another great question from David Mertz. Is the fuzz exportable as geometry? And yes, it is. Because once it becomes, once you create that fuzz, that is geometry. So you can export it. Great question.
All right. If anybody has more questions that they'd like to reach out to us, feel free to reach out to myself on LinkedIn or Kareem at Luxion.com or Ryan at Luxion.com, and we'd be happy to answer those questions. Again, thank you all for sticking with me, and don't forget to stay tuned for upcoming tutorials and other learning content from myself and the Luxion team. Have a spectacular day, everyone. Thank you.